The sound was sharp and final. A heavy book hit the hardwood floor with a dull, echoing thud that seemed to ripple through the entire condo. Pages splayed open like wounded wings. For a split second, the apartment fell into a stunned silence. Frank Miller froze in his wheelchair. His hands were still raised, trembling, as if the Bible were somehow still there, hovering just above his palms. He stared at the floor, unable to breathe, unable to speak, as though something far more fragile than paper had just been torn away from him. Ethan Miller stood over him, jaw clenched, chest rising and falling too fast. His face was flushed, not with guilt, but with fury. "There is no God in this house," Ethan snapped. His voice was steady, cold, rehearsed. "And I'm done pretending there is." Down the hallway behind a half-closed door, Anna neighbor paused mid-step. She had heard raised voices before, everyone in the building had, but this time was different. This time, something in the tone made her stop and listen. Frank was 76 years old. His body had betrayed him months ago. First the pneumonia, then the long hospital stay, then the weakness that never fully went away. The doctors said the wheelchair might be temporary. It wasn't. But what hurt most in that moment wasn't his lungs, or his joints, or the humiliation of being stuck in a chair while his own son towered over him. It was the book on the floor. The Bible wasn't just a Bible, it was a wedding gift. It was worn thin by decades of fingers tracing familiar lines late at night. It was the last thing his wife Rose had ever given him. Frank swallowed hard and finally looked up at his son. "And Ethan," he whispered, his voice cracking, "please be careful. That was your mother's." The words landed like gasoline on a flame. "Don't talk about my mom," Ethan shot back. His eyes flicked down to the open pages, then away again, as if even looking at them made him sick. "She died believing in that fairy tale. And where did it get her?" Frank's mouth opened, then closed. No argument came, no defense, just a quiet, unbearable grief that settled into his bones. Ethan exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. He wore an expensive sweater, the kind that didn't wrinkle, the kind that made him look put together even when everything inside him was falling apart. He had just come back from work, another 12-hour day, another project under threat, another reminder that control was the only thing keeping his world from collapsing. And in his mind, religion was the enemy of control. "This is my place," Ethan continued, his voice lower now, more dangerous. "My rules. I don't want prayers, I don't want crosses, and I don't want to see that book ever again." He nudged the Bible farther away with his foot. Frank closed his eyes. He didn't cry. Not yet. He had learned over the past few months that silence was safer, that answering only made things worse. So he did what he had been doing every day since he moved into his son's modern, minimalist condo on the north side of Chicago. He disappeared inward. If you've ever wondered how families break, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, behind closed doors, this is how it begins. Not with shouting alone, but with grief left untreated, with pain that turns into anger, with love that curdles into control. And if you've ever asked yourself whether grace can still reach places like this, places filled with resentment, bitterness, and unspoken blame, then stay with this story. Because what happened next did not happen in a church, it did not happen during a sermon, and it did not come in the way anyone expected. Before we go any further, if stories of redemption, impossible forgiveness, and moments where heaven collides with ordinary life speak to you, I invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Heaven Walks With Us. These are the stories we exist to tell. That night, Frank would return to his small room and sit by the window, staring out at the streetlights below, whispering prayers he wasn't sure anyone still heard. And Ethan, convinced he had finally silenced God in his home, had no idea that heaven was already closer than he thought. Much closer. Frank Miller had moved into his son's condo 6 months earlier with a single duffel bag, a shoebox of medical papers, and the quiet understanding that he was not supposed to stay long. "Just until you're back on your feet," Ethan had said, standing stiffly in the doorway of his spotless apartment. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't meet his father's eyes. He simply pointed down the hall. "The small room is yours." The room had once been an office, barely large enough for a twin bed and a narrow desk pushed against the wall. There was no closet, just a metal rack for clothes. The window faced the alley, where delivery trucks idled in the mornings and trash bins rattled at night. Frank had nodded and thanked him anyway. He always said thank you. At the time, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. The pneumonia had been severe, but survivable. Physical therapy, medication, time. Medicare covered some of it. Ethan covered the rest with clipped efficiency, paying bills online without comment, without conversation. What no one could fix was the exhaustion that settled deep into Frank's bones. He tried to be invisible. He woke before Ethan so he wouldn't be in the way in the kitchen. He learned how to maneuver his wheelchair quietly across the hardwood floors. He ate less, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he didn't want to be a burden. When Ethan worked late, which was often, Frank reheated leftovers alone and washed the dishes carefully, afraid of making noise. Most of his day was spent in that small room. There he read his Bible, the same one now lying on the floor in the living room. He read slowly, sometimes rereading the same verse over and over when his mind grew tired. On the inside cover, in faded blue ink, was Rose's handwriting, their wedding date, a heart drawn shakily decades ago. That book was his anchor. Ethan, meanwhile, moved through the apartment like a man patrolling his own territory. Everything had its place. Shoes aligned by the door, counters cleared immediately after use. No clutter, no unnecessary objects, no reminders of things he couldn't control. Faith in Ethan's mind was the ultimate reminder of chaos. He had built his life on precision. Architecture had appealed to him for that reason. Clean lines, calculated loads, structures that obeyed rules. If something failed, there was a reason, a formula, a mistake you could identify and correct. There was no room in that worldview for unanswered prayers. Every time he saw his father reading, lips moving silently in prayer, something twisted in his stomach. It wasn't just irritation, it was nausea, a visceral reaction that surprised even him. Because Frank wasn't just praying, Frank was remembering Rose. And Ethan had spent 15 years doing everything he could to forget. Their conversations grew shorter, then functional, then non-existent. Dinners in the fridge, physical therapies at 10. I'll be late tonight. That was it. And beneath the surface of that cold efficiency, something dangerous was growing, an anger that had never been allowed to grieve, now looking for a place to land. Frank felt it. He sensed it in the way Ethan's jaw tightened when he passed his room, in the way silence lingered too long after the sound of a whispered prayer. Still, Frank believed, quietly, stubbornly, that if he just endured, if he stayed gentle, if he didn't provoke, this storm would pass. He didn't know that the storm was only beginning. 15 years earlier, Ethan Miller had believed in God, not in a deep or sophisticated way. He wasn't particularly religious. He didn't read scripture every night or talk about faith with conviction. But he believed enough to pray before exams, enough to whisper please into the dark when things felt uncertain. And then his mother got sick. At first it was small things, fatigue, weight loss, pain she brushed off with a tired smile. By the time the doctors ran the right tests, the diagnosis landed like a sentence. Pancreatic cancer. Advanced, aggressive. Ethan was 22 years old. He had just graduated college. His future felt wide open, job interviews, plans, possibilities. Overnight, all of it narrowed to hospital corridors and oncology wards that smelled like antiseptic and quiet despair. Rose Miller faced the diagnosis with a calm that unsettled him. She cried, yes. She was afraid, of course, but she also prayed. A lot. She kept a small rosary in her hand during chemo sessions. She asked the priest from their parish to visit. She read her Bible when the nausea eased enough for her to focus. God has a plan, she would say softly, her voice thinner each week. He's with us, even now. Ethan hated those words. He watched his mother grow weaker day by day, watched her hair fall out in clumps, watched her body betray her in slow, humiliating ways. And all the while she thanked God for strength, for peace, for another morning. What kind of plan is this? Ethan snapped one night, not unable to hold it in anymore. He stood at the foot of her hospital bed, fists clenched. "You're dying, Mom. You're praying to someone who's letting this happen." Rose looked at him with eyes that were tired but steady. "I know it doesn't make sense to you," she said gently, "but I'm not alone in this. I can feel him with me." Ethan turned away, jaw tight. He stayed through every treatment. He drove her to appointments. He slept in uncomfortable chairs and learned the beeping rhythms of machines he couldn't control. And when the pain became unbearable, when the doctors spoke in quieter voices and the word palliative entered the conversation, Ethan began to bargain. Not with God, with reality. If there was no God, then this was just biology. Bad luck. Randomness. Something he could endure without having to feel betrayed. Rose died early one August morning, just before sunrise. She was surrounded by crucifixes and whispered prayers. Frank held her hand. Ethan stood by the window, arms crossed, staring at the city waking up outside. He didn't cry. At the funeral, he didn't sing. He didn't kneel. When the priest spoke about eternal life, Ethan felt something inside him harden into stone. This is a lie, he told himself. A story people tell when they can't face the truth. After the burial, Frank reached for him, grief etched into every line of his face. Ethan pulled away. "Don't," he said coldly. This faith of yours didn't save her." Frank never forgot those words, and Ethan never forgave God for a death he couldn't explain. From that day on, belief became the enemy. And then anything that reminded him of it, including his own father, became something he needed to control. After his mother's death, Ethan did what he did best. He worked. He poured himself into architecture with a focus that bordered on obsession. Long hours became normal. 18-hour days didn't feel extreme. They felt necessary. While other young professionals talked about balance, Ethan talked about output, precision, execution. Pain, he discovered, was manageable when buried under productivity. His talent was undeniable. He climbed quickly, earning respect in a competitive firm where mistakes were costly and deadlines unforgiving. Clients liked him because he was sharp, efficient, and emotionally distant. Projects didn't fail under Ethan's watch. People did, but buildings didn't. Control became his religion. When Frank tried awkwardly, gently to check in on his son, Ethan kept the conversations brief. Phone calls ended quickly. Visits became rare. He told himself it was normal. Life moved on. People aged. Loss was inevitable. Better not to dwell. In his early 30s, Ethan married a colleague, smart, driven, equally allergic to mess. The wedding was tasteful and minimal, the kind of event that looked perfect in photos, but revealed very little of what was happening underneath. They didn't argue much. They didn't connect much either. When his wife suggested therapy, gently, carefully, after one too many nights of silence, Ethan shut it down immediately. "I don't need someone digging around in my head," he said. "I'm fine." She tried again after a year. He responded with irritation. She left 6 months later. And the divorce was efficient. Paperwork signed, assets divided, no children, no dramatic scenes. Just a quiet ending that left Ethan alone in a carefully curated condo, surrounded by clean surfaces and unspoken questions. He told himself he preferred it this way. But sometimes, late at night, when the city lights flickered through the windows and there was no noise left to drown out his thoughts, something stirred beneath the surface, a tightness in his chest, a familiar anger, a grief that refused to stay buried. Frank, meanwhile, aged quietly. He stayed in his small apartment for as long as he could. He attended church every Sunday. He lit candles for Rose. He prayed for his son, not for success because Ethan already had that, but for peace. When Frank got sick, seriously sick, Ethan felt something he didn't want to name: responsibility. There was no one else. His sister had moved out of the country years earlier. Friends suggested assisted living. Ethan dismissed it immediately, not out of tenderness, but because it felt like failure. "I'll handle it," he said. He meant it. He just didn't understand what handling it would eventually cost him, because inviting his father into his home didn't heal the old wound. It pressed directly on it. And with every whispered prayer, every quiet mention of God, every reminder of the faith Ethan had rejected, the anger he thought he'd mastered began to rise again. Stronger, sharper, and far more dangerous than before. The rules didn't arrive all at once. At first, they were reasonable, or at least they sounded that way. "I just don't want religious stuff in the living room," Ethan said one evening, eyes fixed on his laptop. This is a shared space." Frank nodded. He always nodded. He moved the small wooden cross from the shelf near the window back into his room. It had been there for years, but he didn't argue. He told himself it wasn't important where the cross was placed, only what it meant. A few days later, another rule appeared. "I don't want prayers before meal," Ethan said, standing by the counter with his phone in hand. "It makes things awkward." Frank felt a familiar tightening in his chest. For decades, grace before meals had been automatic, barely a thought. Now he folded his hands under the table instead, mouthing the words silently while Ethan scrolled through emails. The silence tasted bitter. Then came the next instruction. "If you need to read that book," Ethan said, not looking at him, "do it in your room." Door closed. Frank hesitated just long enough for Ethan to notice. "This is my house," Ethan added, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "I'm not asking." So Frank retreated. More and more, his world shrank to the dimensions of that small room. The hallway became something to cross quickly. The kitchen, a place to enter only when necessary. The living room, once a shared space, felt off limits, charged with an invisible tension that made his hands shake. Ethan noticed the changes. He told himself they were necessary. Every whispered prayer felt like a provocation. Every glimpse of the Bible reminded him of hospital rooms and unanswered pleas. He didn't see a harmless old man clinging to faith. He saw the ghost of his mother dying slowly while trusting a God who never intervened. And resentment, once given permission, rarely stays contained. The restrictions tightened. Frank could use the kitchen, but only when Ethan wasn't on conference calls. He could watch TV, but not anything religious. He could sit by the window, but Ethan preferred the blinds partially closed. Too much light made the room feel cluttered. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't violent. It was systematic. Frank complied with each request, telling himself that patience was a form of love, that endurance mattered, that maybe, just maybe, his son's anger would burn itself out if he didn't feed it. But something inside Ethan was feeding on the compliance. Control felt good. It made the anxiety recede just a little. It gave him the illusion that he was fixing something that had once spiraled beyond his grasp. And then one evening, as Frank rolled quietly back to his room, Ethan noticed the Bible resting on the edge of the kitchen table. Not open, not displayed, just there. Something snapped. Ethan stood frozen, staring at it as if it were an intruder that had crossed a line. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed. He didn't say anything that night, but the rules had already crossed a threshold, and what came next would no longer be subtle. Ethan came home later than usual that night. The project he had been counting on, weeks of revisions, negotiations, late calls, had gone to another firm. A cleaner proposal, a cheaper bid. A loss he couldn't spin away with logic or effort. Failure sat heavy in his chest as he unlocked the door. The condo was quiet, too quiet. He tossed his keys onto the counter, loosened his tie, and walked into the kitchen, already replaying the meeting in his head. That's when he saw it. The Bible. It rested on the edge of the kitchen table, its worn leather cover slightly cracked, a corner bent where decades of use had softened it. Frank must have set it there while making tea, just for a moment, just long enough to forget the rules. Ethan stopped short. Something hot and irrational surged up his spine. He stared at the book as if it were alive, as if it had been placed there deliberately, a quiet act of defiance. "How many times?" he muttered under his breath. He grabbed it. Frank heard the sound before he saw anything. The sudden scrape of the wheelchair turning too quickly, the heavy footsteps entering his room without warning. Ethan burst through the door like a storm. "What did I tell you?" he shouted, his voice sharp and echoing off the walls. Frank looked up, startled. His hands instinctively reached out, as if to protect what he hadn't even seen yet. "Ethan, The Bible flew from Ethan's hands. It hit the floor hard, pages exploding open, the spine cracking in a way that made Frank flinch as though he'd been struck. "I am sick of this," Ethan snarled. "Sick of you shoving this garbage into my space." Frank's chest tightened. He leaned forward in his chair, reaching with trembling fingers. "Please," he said softly, "please don't do that. That Bible was your mother's." For a moment there was silence. Then Ethan's face twisted. "Don't say her name," he roared. "She died praying to that thing, and it did nothing. Nothing." He kicked the Bible aside with careless force. Frank felt something inside him cave. "That book," he whispered, tears finally breaking free. "It's all I have left of her." The words only made it worse. Ethan bent down, picked the Bible up with exaggerated disdain, and walked out of the room. Frank followed as best he could, wheeling after him, heart pounding, lungs burning. Ethan didn't stop in the living room. He went to the kitchen. He reached up, high above the cabinets, above the refrigerator, and placed the Bible on the top shelf, where it disappeared from Frank's reach. "There," Ethan said coldly. "Let's see if your God can bring it down from there." Frank stared upward. The distance wasn't much, just a few inches, but it might as well have been miles. Ethan turned back toward him, eyes hard. "If you're going to live here," he said, "you live by my rules. And rule number 1 is this: there is no God in this house." Frank couldn't respond. He lowered his head, my shoulders shaking, humiliation and grief crushing down on him at once. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply sat there, defeated. Ethan watched for a moment longer, then turned away, already convincing himself that this was necessary, that boundaries had to be enforced, that pain had to be confronted. He didn't notice that something else had just begun. Not a confrontation, a countdown. After that night, something shifted in the apartment. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was subtler than that, and far more dangerous. Ethan didn't apologize. He didn't bring the Bible down. In fact, he began acting as if the incident had settled something, as if a line had finally been drawn and order restored. Frank felt it immediately. The next morning, breakfast appeared outside his door instead of on the kitchen table. A plate slid carefully onto the carpet, a knock that was barely audible. "I've got meetings," Ethan said through the door. "Just eat in your room." Frank stared at the plate for a long moment before opening the door. The food was still warm, but something about the gesture made his hands shake. Meals like that became routine. Sometimes the food was hot, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes Ethan knocked, sometimes he didn't. There was no pattern, only mood. Frank learned to listen for footsteps, to time his movements so he wouldn't cross paths with his son. When he needed the bathroom, he went quickly, silently, apologizing under his breath for taking up space. Ethan began referring to it as efficiency. "I just need things to be predictable," he told himself. "This isn't abuse. This is structure." The television disappeared next. "Huh, you don't need it," Ethan said flatly when Frank asked. "It uses too much electricity, and you should rest more." Frank didn't argue. He nodded and thanked him, even though the TV had been his only connection to the outside world. News, weather, familiar voices filling the silence. A few days later, Frank noticed something else was missing. His phone. It was a simple device. No internet. No apps. Just a way to call his sister, his parish office, the neighbor down the hall who had once offered to help. He searched his room carefully, panic building with each passing second. "Have you seen my phone?" he asked softly when Ethan passed by. Ethan didn't stop walking. "Did you lose it?" he replied, tone neutral. "You should be more careful." Frank knew better. The realization settled slowly and then all at once. He was cut off. No calls. No visitors. No way out. Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor across the hall, knocked twice that week. Frank heard it from his room, hope surging briefly in his chest. Ethan answered both times with a tight, polite smile. "We're fine," he said. "Thanks for checking." The door closed. The silence returned. Inside, Frank spent hours by the window, watching people come and go. Couples walking dogs, children racing scooters down the sidewalk, older men leaning on canes, talking and laughing as if the world hadn't forgotten them. He wondered when he had disappeared. At night, he stared up at the ceiling, his eyes drifting toward the kitchen, toward the place where his Bible waited, unreachable, like a promise suspended just beyond his grasp. Once, in a moment of desperation, he tried. He wheeled himself forward, locked the brakes, on and stretched as far as he could, fingers straining upward. The shelf remained just out of reach. His arms trembled. His breath came fast and shallow. Finally, he slumped back, exhausted, tears slipping down his cheeks. That night, alone in the dark, Frank whispered words he had never allowed himself to say before. "Lord," he murmured, voice breaking, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." And somewhere deep inside the apartment, unseen and unnoticed, the pressure began to build, quietly, steadily, toward a breaking point that no amount of control could stop. Mrs. Thompson had lived across the hall for almost 10 years. She knew the rhythms of the building, the doors that slammed, the couples that argued loudly and then made up, the neighbors who came and went without ever learning each other's names. She wasn't nosy by nature, but she was observant, and lately something felt wrong. It wasn't just the shouting, though there had been plenty of that in recent weeks. It was what followed, the long, heavy silence, the kind that pressed against the walls and lingered far too long for comfort. She had seen Frank Miller before, a quiet older man, polite, always saying thank you. He used to smile when he passed her in the hallway, wheeling himself carefully toward the elevator. Sometimes he mentioned church. Sometimes he asked about her grandkids. Then suddenly she stopped seeing him. Days went by, then weeks. One afternoon, Mrs. Thompson heard a sound that made her pause in the middle of folding laundry. A muffled sob, followed by the scrape of metal against tile. A wheelchair, she realized, straining, failing. Her hands froze. She walked to her door and pressed her ear against it. Nothing now, just the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Her phone was in her hand before she fully realized it. Adult Protective Services, the police, someone. But doubt crept in quickly. She didn't know the full story. She hadn't seen bruises. There were no screams for help, just tension, control. Things that were harder to explain, harder to prove. And Ethan, she knew who he was. Well-dressed, confident. The kind of man people assumed was doing everything right. He worked long hours. He paid his bills. He smiled when he needed to. What if she was wrong? What if she made things worse? She knocked on their door twice that week. Each time, Ethan answered. "Everything's fine," he said smoothly. "My dad remembers things differently sometimes. He's sensitive." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, searching his face for cracks she could trust. She found none, so she nodded. She apologized for bothering him. She went back to her apartment with a knot in her stomach that refused to loosen. That night, lying awake in bed, she stared at the ceiling, replaying the sounds she'd heard, the anger, the sobbing, the quiet despair that leaked through walls too thin to contain it. I should do something, she thought. Tomorrow, maybe. But tomorrow came and went. And her silence, well-intentioned, fearful, human, became part of the story. Down the hall, Frank sat alone by his window, unaware that someone had almost reached for help on his behalf. Almost. And in the quiet space between what should have been done and what wasn't, the night crept closer, bringing with it a reckoning no one in that building could have imagined. The party started on a Friday night. Ethan hadn't planned it in advance. It was impulsive, born out of frustration, alcohol, and a restless need to feel validated. He texted a few coworkers, some friends from the gym, a couple of people who shared his sharp humor and his skepticism about anything that couldn't be proven. They showed up quickly. Music thumped through the condo, bass vibrating through the walls. Bottles lined the counter. Laughter filled the space, loud and careless, the kind that came easily when people believed they were among their own. Frank heard it all from his room. Every beat, every burst of laughter, every voice that wasn't his. He sat in his wheelchair near the window, hands folded in his lap, trying to ignore the noise. He told himself it would end soon, that he just needed to be patient. In the living room, someone made a joke about religion. "I saw a guy preaching outside the train station this morning," one of Ethan's colleagues said, raising a glass. "Felt like stepping back into the Middle Ages." Laughter erupted. Ethan smiled, then laughed harder. "It's all coping mechanisms," he added easily. "Some people just can't handle reality without a myth to hold on to." More laughter, More nods. The sound carried down the hallway like a blade. Frank closed his eyes and pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The walls were too thin. The words slipped through anyway, settling deep in his chest. Around midnight, fueled by alcohol and applause, Ethan made a decision he would later struggle to remember, but never forget. "Hey," he announced suddenly, standing up and turning the music down just enough to command attention. "Huh, you guys want to meet my dad?" A few people exchanged uncertain looks. Ethan didn't wait for an answer. He walked down the hall and flung open Frank's door. Light flooded the small room. Music spilled in. Voices followed. "Come on," Ethan said loudly, grabbing the wheelchair handles and pulling Frank forward. "Don't be shy." Frank's heart slammed against his ribs. "Ethan, please," he whispered. "Not tonight." But the wheelchair rolled on. They stopped in the doorway of the living room. Conversations died down as eyes turned toward the old man in worn pajamas, his face pale, his eyes red from crying. "This," Ethan said with a crooked grin, "is my father." A few people murmured awkward hellos. One woman stepped forward instinctively. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked gently. Ethan waved her off. "He's fine," he said. "Just a little sensitive. Honey, he's old school. Still believes in God." A couple of guests chuckled. Ethan gestured toward the kitchen, toward the top of the cabinets. "See that up there?" he continued, voice thick with sarcasm. "That's his Bible. I put it somewhere safe." He raised his glass. "Let's see if God brings it down for him." The laughter this time was louder, sharper, crueler. Frank felt something inside him finally break, not loudly but completely. This wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was annihilation, the certainty that he was utterly alone in a room full of people. Ethan watched his face for a brief moment. Something flickered there, something dangerously close to doubt. He pushed it away. The party continued. By 3 in the morning, the guests were gone. Bottles were empty, music faded. Honey Ethan stumbled to his bedroom and collapsed onto the bed without a second thought. Down the hall, Frank remained awake in his wheelchair, staring at the ceiling. The condo was silent now, and in that silence, for the first time in his life, Frank didn't know what to pray. The silence after the party was heavier than the noise that came before it. Frank sat alone in his wheelchair, hands resting uselessly on his knees, eyes fixed on the faint shadow where the ceiling met the wall. The air felt thick, unmoving, as if the apartment itself were holding its breath. Ethan was asleep down the hall. Frank knew by the sound of it, the deep, uneven breathing, the soft snore that came only after too much alcohol and too much anger spent. For the first time that night, Frank allowed himself to cry. Not quietly, not politely. His shoulders shook as sobs tore through him, raw and uncontrolled. He pressed a hand over his mouth, but the sound still escaped. Years of grief spilling out all at once. "Rose," he whispered into the darkness. "I don't know what to do anymore." He thought of her hands, warm and steady, turning the thin pages of the Bible beside him in bed. He remembered how she used to read aloud when his eyes were tired, how her voice softened even the hardest passages. "Where are you now?" he wondered. "Can you see this? Can you see what our son has become?" The absence of the Bible felt like a wound that wouldn't close. Frank had spent decades leaning on those words, memorizing them, letting them carry him through loss and doubt alike. Now without it, his mind betrayed him. Verses slipped away, prayers tangled. He tried to pray anyway. "Ew, Lord," he murmured, his voice barely more than breath. "I've always believed. I've trusted you, even when I didn't understand. But tonight," his words faltered. Tonight the questions came. Why did you take her? Why did you let my son turn so cold? Why am I here, humiliated, trapped, forgotten? The thoughts frightened him, not because they were new, but because he had never let them surface before. Faith had always been his refuge. Now it felt fragile, like glass already cracked. "Maybe Ethan is right," he whispered, the admission burning his throat. "Maybe I'm just an old man clinging to stories because I'm afraid of dying." The room offered no answer. Frank closed his eyes, exhausted by the weight of his own doubt. For a moment he considered the unthinkable, that perhaps there was no one listening, that Rose was simply gone, and that this suffering had no meaning beyond itself. But then, faintly, something stirred. A memory, A verse Rose used to repeat when the pain was worst, when the doctors spoke in careful tones and the nights felt endless. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Frank whispered slowly, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The words didn't banish the darkness. They didn't erase the doubt, but they steadied him. Frank inhaled deeply, wincing as his lungs protested, and tried again. Lord, he said, this time with a strange, quiet honesty, I'm not asking you to fix everything. I don't even know if I can ask that anymore. His voice broke. Just give me the strength to survive one more day, that's all. One more day. He paused, tears sliding down his cheeks. Boy, and if you can't, if that's not your will, then take me home. Take me to Rose. I don't want to be here like this anymore. The city outside slept uneasily. Somewhere below, a garbage truck rattled past. A distant siren wailed and faded. Frank's head dipped forward as exhaustion claimed him. He hovered between waking and sleep, his prayer hanging in the air like an unanswered question. On the wall, the digital clock glowed softly. 3:33 a.m. And at that exact moment, something in the apartment changed. The air shifted, and somewhere down the hall, a sound began that would shatter everything Frank and Ethan thought they knew about reality. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking cut through Ethan's sleep like a blade. Not loud, not frantic, precise. He groaned and rolled onto his side, head pounding, mouth dry. The remnants of laughter and music still echoed faintly in his skull. He squinted at the dim glow of his phone on the nightstand. 3:33 a.m. Are you kidding me? He muttered. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring it. Whoever it was could wait. But the knock came again. 3 measured raps, identical to the first. Calm, patient, unavoidable. Ethan swung his legs off the bed, irritation flaring as he pulled on a hoodie. He stepped into the hallway, passing his father's closed door without a glance. The condo felt different now. Too quiet, too still, like the pause before a storm. Who is it? He called, stopping short of the door. No answer. The knocking came again, 3 times. Same rhythm, same restraint. Ethan leaned forward and peered through the peephole. A man stood in the hallway, tall, still, dressed in white, simple, unadorned. His shoulders draped with a deep red scarf that fell naturally down his chest. He was barefoot on the cold tile, as if the hour and the temperature didn't apply to him. Something about the sight made Ethan's stomach tighten. Can I help you? Ethan barked through the door, forcing annoyance into his voice. It's the middle of the night. The man looked directly at the door, not at the peephole, but as if he could see straight through it. His voice, when it came, was soft, clear. I've come for Frank. Ethan's breath caught. No one should have known his father's name. No one in this building used it. The neighbors barely spoke. His hands, he realized, were trembling, not from fear exactly, but from something deeper, more disorienting. How do you know my father? Ethan demanded. There was a pause. Then the man spoke again, gently. Sona, you know who I am. Ethan laughed, sharp and hollow. No, he snapped. I don't. And you need to leave. But his body betrayed him. His hand reached for the lock before his mind could stop it. The door opened. The hallway light spilled into the condo, but the man didn't wait for an invitation. He took one step forward, then another, and crossed the threshold as if it were his by right. Ethan stepped back instinctively, heart hammering. Hey, who do you think you are? He demanded. But the words came out weaker than he intended. The man stopped in the center of the living room and looked around slowly. His gaze fell on the overturned chairs, the empty bottles, the lingering mess of the night before. Sadness flickered across his face, brief but unmistakable. Then he turned back to Ethan. Where is he? The man asked. Ethan tried to answer. Sorry, he couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the floor, his muscles locked in place. Panic surged as he fought against his own body, but nothing responded. The man walked past him, down the hallway, his steps quiet and deliberate, toward his father's room. And for the first time in 20 years, Ethan Miller felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since his mother died. Fear, not of the man, but of the truth he might bring with him. Frank heard the footsteps before he saw anyone. They were unhurried, measured. Each step carried a weight that made the air in the room feel denser, as if the walls themselves were listening. His heart began to race. "Ethan!" Frank called softly, his voice thin from exhaustion. There was no answer, only the approach of something unfamiliar and yet strangely expected. And then the figure appeared in the doorway. Light followed him in. Not harsh, not blinding, just enough to soften the shadows that had ruled the room moments before. The man stepped inside with a grace that felt completely out of place in the cramped, cluttered space. His white garment moved gently, the red scarf resting over his shoulders like a quiet declaration. Frank forgot how to breathe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The man knelt in front of Frank's wheelchair, lowering himself until their eyes were level. His gaze held no urgency, no surprise, only recognition. "Frank," he said. The sound of his name, spoken like that, undid him. Tears blurred Frank's vision as his hands lifted without thinking, trembling as they reached for the face before him. "My lord," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. "Is it really you?" The man smiled, a smile that carried decades of prayers, nights of loneliness, whispered pleas spoken into the dark. A smile that said every tear had been seen. "It is," he replied gently. "I have heard every prayer. I have been with you in every moment you thought you were alone." Frank's shoulders collapsed inward as sobs took him. He hadn't realized how much weight he had been carrying until it was suddenly gone. Strong, steady hands rested on his knees. Warmth spread outward from the touch. Slow at first, then unmistakable. It moved through his legs, his chest, his lungs. Frank gasped as air filled his body freely, deeply, without the familiar burn or wheeze. "What? What are you doing?" Frank breathed. The man rose smoothly to his feet and extended a hand. "I'm reminding you," he said, "Yana, what it feels like to be whole." Frank stared at the hand, his mind struggling to catch up with his body. The tremor that had lived in his fingers for months was gone. His legs, long numb, long useless, felt solid, present. "Stand up," the man said calmly. "Walk." Frank hesitated, not from doubt, from awe. Then, with a faith that surprised even him, he placed his hand in the one offered. Strength surged upward as he rose, first unsteadily, then firmly, until he was standing on his own 2 feet. He laughed through tears, a sound he hadn't made in years. I can feel them," he said in disbelief. "I can breathe." The man drew him into an embrace, and Frank felt decades of grief dissolve in that single moment. His wife's death, his son's anger, the long nights of quiet endurance. Down the hallway, Ethan watched. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His father, his frail, broken father, stood without assistance, walking slowly across the room with a strength that defied every diagnosis, every scan, every rational explanation Ethan had ever trusted. Tears streamed down Ethan's face without permission, blurring his vision as something deep inside him began to fracture. The man turned then, his gaze meeting Ethan's from across the hallway. With each step he took toward him, Ethan felt the walls he had built begin to crack. Memories surged forward, his mother's smile, the hospital room, words he had said that could never be taken back. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan managed to whisper, his voice shaking. "Why are you here?" The man stopped in front of him. "I came for your father," he said softly. Then his eyes softened further, somehow deeper than before. "Yes, and I came for you." Ethan's knees gave out. He fell to the floor, the sound echoing through the condo as years of buried pain rose to the surface all at once, raw, unfiltered, and finally impossible to deny. And in that moment, Ethan Miller understood something terrifying and beautiful all at once. The God he had spent 15 years trying to silence had never stopped knocking. Ethan knelt on the cold floor, his hands braced against the hardwood, as if the ground were the only thing keeping him from falling into something bottomless. He tried to breathe. His chest refused to cooperate. Tears dripped onto the floor, slow at first, then faster, each one carrying a weight he had spent years denying. He hadn't cried like this since he was 22, since the night his mother died and something inside him shut down to survive. When the man in white stood before him, waiting, not rushing, not interrupting, waiting the way someone waits when they already know what is coming. Images flooded Ethan's mind without warning. He was 12 again, sitting in a hospital chair too big for his body, swinging his feet while machines beeped steadily beside his mother's bed. Rose reached for his hand, weak but smiling. "Why do you still believe?" young Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "Why do you keep praying if it isn't fixing anything?" She had squeezed his fingers gently. "Because he never leaves me," she said, "even when I'm scared." The memory shifted. Now Ethan stood at her funeral, wearing a black suit that didn't quite fit. He remembered the way his fist clenched as the priest spoke of heaven, the way anger roared in his ears so loudly he couldn't hear the hymns. There is no plan, he had thought, only pain. Another memory rose, his father reaching for him after the burial, the hesitation, the quiet plea in Frank's eyes. Ethan pulling away, his words sharp enough to wound. "This is your fault," he had said. "You filled her head with lies." The memory burned. Ethan gasped and doubled over, clutching his chest as if trying to rip something out. "Stop," he whispered hoarsely. "Please, stop." But the images continued, not to punish him, but to show him the truth he had refused to see. College debates where he mocked believers with cutting precision. Office parties where he rolled his eyes at prayer. His wife's face when she suggested therapy, hope flickering just before he extinguished it with sarcasm. Each moment lined up, one after another, forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The man in white spoke at last. "Why do you hate what you do not know?" The question struck like a hammer. Ethan looked up, eyes wild, face wet with tears. "Because you took my mother," he shouted, the words ripping free at last. "She was good. She was kind. She didn't deserve to suffer like that." His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "I watched her fade away day by day while she prayed to you. I watched her thank you while you did nothing. So either you don't exist or you're cruel." The silence that followed was immense. Ethan braced himself for anger, for judgment, for the righteous condemnation he had spent years daring God to deliver. None came. Instead, the man knelt before him. Up close, his eyes held a depth that made Ethan's chest ache. Not accusation, but sorrow shared. "Your pain is real," he said quietly. "Honor and your anger make sense from where you stand." Ethan's breath hitched. "But there are truths you cannot yet see," the man continued. "Your mother was not abandoned. She was not ignored. And her suffering was not meaningless." Frank stepped forward then, his footsteps steady, strong. "Son," he said softly, "I never told you this, but your mother came to me in a dream 3 years after she passed." Ethan stared at him, disbelieving. "She said you were the one who needed prayer the most," Frank continued, voice firm with love. "She said your pain was eating you alive, and she asked me to never stop praying for you, even when you hated me." Ethan's defenses crumbled. Something inside his chest gave way with a sound he almost heard. He collapsed forward, shoulders shaking violently as sobs tore through him, stripped of pride, stripped of armor. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't know how to live with the pain." Frank knelt beside him and wrapped his arms around his son, holding him the way he had when Ethan was small and nightmares came in the dark. The man in white watched them, tears tracing silent paths down his face. "Forgiveness has been here all along," he said softly. "You only needed to stop running from it." Ethan lifted his head, eyes red, voice barely audible. "What am I to you?" he asked. "After everything I've done, why did you come?" The man placed a hand over Ethan's heart. "Because I love you," he said, "and love does not wait for worthiness." For the first time in years, Ethan didn't argue. He simply wept. The room was quiet again. Not the suffocating silence of before, but a stillness that felt alive, attentive, as if the night itself were waiting. Ethan remained on his knee, his forehead pressed lightly against his father's chest. Frank held him there, one hand resting on his son's back, steady and warm. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't pull away. The man in white turned toward the kitchen. Ethan followed his gaze instinctively. The Bible still sat where Ethan had put it, on the highest shelf above the refrigerator, Out of reach, meant to mock faith and prove a point. Without a word, the man walked to it. He reached up easily and took the book down with a reverence that made Ethan's throat tighten. The worn leather rested in his hands as if it belonged there, as if it had been waiting. He opened it, not randomly, not carefully searching. He turned directly to a page already marked. "Read this," he said, holding the book out to Ethan. Ethan hesitated. His hands trembled as he took it, the weight of the object suddenly immense. He recognized the page immediately. Psalm 23, his mother's favorite. But there was something else. In the margin, written in faded blue ink, was his mother's handwriting. Ethan's breath caught. He would have recognized it anywhere. The slight slant, the careful loops, the way the letters pressed a little too hard when she was tired. His voice broke as he began to read. "My dearest Ethan," he whispered, "if you're reading this, it means I've gone home." Tears splashed onto the page, blurring the words. He blinked and kept going. "I know you're angry. I know you'll wonder why God didn't heal me the way you wanted him to. Please don't blame him for my illness. This is not punishment. It's part of a mystery bigger than any of us." Ethan had to stop. His chest felt like it was caving in. Frank placed a gentle hand on the Bible, steadying it, and continued reading where his son couldn't. "I am not afraid," Frank read softly. "God has been with me every step of this journey. He isn't taking my pain away, but he is filling it with meaning." Ethan pressed the book to his chest, a sob tearing free. "I chose to trust him," Frank read on, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because it was easy, but because love doesn't disappear just because suffering exists." The final lines were written shakily, the ink uneven. "Ethan, my love, keep your heart open. One day you will understand that faith isn't believing God will save us from pain. It's believing he will walk with us through it." There was a small heart drawn at the bottom of the page. Ethan's shoulders shook as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." The man in white placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "She hears you," he said gently, "and she forgives you." Ethan looked up, eyes red and swollen, completely undone. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "I want to believe. I really do. But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I fall back into who I was?" A soft smile touched the man's face. "Faith isn't the absence of doubt," he said. "It's choosing to move forward despite it." He stepped back, giving Ethan space to stand. Frank rose beside his son, strong and steady, still hardly believing his own legs were carrying him. "You don't need to be strong," the man continued. "You only need to be willing. I will do the rest." The first hints of dawn crept through the windows, washing the condo in pale light. The mess of the night before, empty bottles, in the overturned chairs, looked strangely distant now, like remnants of another life. The man turned toward the door. "Wait," Ethan said, scrambling to his feet. "Will I see you again?" The man paused and looked back. "You will," he said. "Every time you choose love over resentment, every time you forgive when it's easier to harden your heart, every time you look at your father and see not weakness, but grace." He stepped closer and placed a hand over Ethan's heart. "I live here now," he said quietly, "if you make room for me." Warmth spread through Ethan's chest, steady, grounding, real. "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "I don't want to live in the dark anymore." The man nodded once, satisfied. Then he opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the growing light of morning wrapping around him as he walked away. My Frank and Ethan stood in the doorway long after he was gone. Neither spoke. They didn't need to, because everything had already changed. The miracle didn't end that morning. It began there. 3 years passed, not in a rush, but in a quiet unfolding, day by day, choice by choice. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but reveals its power over time. Ethan Miller was no longer the man people feared. He still worked as an architect, but success no longer ruled him. He turned down projects that would have required constant travel. He left the office earlier. He learned how to cook, badly at first, because his father liked warm dinners eaten together at the table. Frank never returned to the wheelchair. Doctors ran tests, then more tests. They argued, shrugged, also offered cautious language like spontaneous remission and medically unexplainable. Ethan listened politely, but he didn't need convincing. He had seen too much. Every morning Frank read from the Bible, the same worn copy Ethan once tried to erase from the house. Sometimes Ethan listened. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes they sat in silence, sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. Faith didn't arrive in Ethan as certainty. It arrived as humility. On Sundays, Ethan opened his home. At first, it was just one person, a co-worker who hadn't spoken to his father in years. Then another, and another. Soon, folding chairs filled the living room. Coffee brewed constantly. Stories emerged hesitantly, then freely. They called it second chair, a place for sons and daughters who had left their parents waiting too long, and a place where shame wasn't shushed but understood, where forgiveness wasn't forced but invited. Ethan never preached. He told the truth. "I thought my anger made me strong," he would say, "but it only made me lonely." Frank sat quietly in the corner during these meetings, watching his son with a soft, knowing smile. He never interrupted, never corrected. He had prayed for this man long before Ethan became him. One winter, Frank fell ill again. This time it was different. The doctors were honest. The prognosis was gentle but final. Ethan didn't panic. He moved his father's bed closer to the window. He read to him every night, sometimes scripture, sometimes old letters, sometimes nothing at all. They talked about Ethan's childhood, about Rose, about regrets that no longer held power. One evening, as snow drifted past the glass, Frank took Ethan's hand. "I never doubted that God would answer my prayer," he said softly. "I just didn't know how." Ethan swallowed hard. "He came for you." Frank shook his head. "No, son. He came for both of us." Frank passed away quietly in the spring. Ethan held his hand until the very end. At the funeral, the room overflowed. Neighbors, co-workers, people from second chair, people whose stories had changed because Ethan had dared to change first. When Ethan stood to speak, he didn't talk about miracles. He talked about patience, about how love waits even when it's rejected, about how faith is sometimes nothing more than staying when it would be easier to leave. Afterward, Ethan returned to the condo alone. The silence was different now. He found the Bible on the shelf, now his Bible. Inside, tucked carefully between the pages, were two notes, one from his mother, one from his father. He sat in Frank's old chair and read them again. That night, as darkness settled, Ethan felt it. Not a vision, not a voice, just a presence. Steady, familiar, like someone sitting beside him, not to fix anything, but to stay. Ethan smiled through tears. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed, lights flickered, life continued. But inside that quiet room, something eternal remained. Love that had outlasted anger, faith that had survived doubt, and a son who finally came home. Before you leave this video, take a moment, because stories like this don't end when the screen goes dark. They linger. They whisper questions we've been avoiding. When was the last time you truly listened to your father, your mother, someone who loved you, even when you pushed them away? If this story touched something deep inside you, please subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us. Not just for more stories, but for reminders. Reminders that it's not too late, that forgiveness is still possible, that love can survive anger, and that even in our darkest moments, heaven still walks with us. Subscribe now, turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss the next story that might arrive exactly when your heart needs it most. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever been angry at God, at life, at a parent who didn't understand you, or whom you didn't understand? Or maybe there's someone you've been meaning to forgive, but haven't found the courage yet. Write in the comments, "I forgive," "I'm trying," or simply, "I'm listening." You don't need perfect words, just honesty. Because someone else reading your comment tonight might realize they're not alone. And if there's a parent in your life, a father, a mother, a grandparent, who needs to hear, "I love you," don't wait. Send them a message, make the call, break the silence. Tomorrow is never guaranteed. But grace is always available right now. Thank you for walking with us. This is Heaven Walks With Us.